Hello and welcome back. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're taking a magnifying glass to a very specific and incredibly intense slice of history.
Right.
We are looking at just 61 days, only 2 months. But you can make a very strong argument that these are the 61 days that shattered the old world and, well, built the one we're living in right now.
It's a fascinating way to approach it. Usually when we talk about the Second World War, we look at the whole 6-year sweep.
The big battles, the famous names.
Exactly. D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway, Hiroshima. But if you really, and I mean really, want to understand how the 20th century was forged, you have to zoom in. You have to look at that window between September 1st, 1939 and October 31st, 1939.
Okay, so let's establish the premise here for everyone. The idea is that on August 31st, 1939, the sun basically set on the old world. And by the time you get to Halloween, October 31st, everything has fundamentally changed. The map of Europe is different. The way wars are fought is different. Even the future of technology has been set on a new, terrifying path.
It's the collision point. That's the best way I can describe it. You have this 19th century mindset, this idea of formal declarations and ultimatums.
A kind of gentlemanly diplomacy, almost.
Almost, yes. And that collides head-on with 20th century industrial destruction. It's the moment where you have the birth of the atomic age happening quietly in a committee room.
While somewhere else, armies are still thinking about the role of cavalry.
Precisely. You have the dawn of modern computing, the very beginnings of it, happening in a quiet country manor house in England while tanks are rolling across the plains of Poland. It's all happening at once in this 61-day window.
So let's set that scene. We're in the late summer of 1939. The tension in Europe has been building for years. I mean, you've had the annexation of Austria, the Sudetenland crisis in Czechoslovakia.
It's been one crisis after another. Everyone feels something is coming, but no one's quite sure what it will look like.
But September 1st is the catalyst. That's the day the dam doesn't just crack, it bursts.
September 1st, 1939, the German invasion of Poland. This is it. This is the moment that all the abstract fears, all the diplomatic maneuvering, it all becomes a concrete, violent reality.
German forces cross the frontier.
They cross the frontier, and almost at the same time, they formally annexed the free city of Danzig, which had been this huge point of contention. But what's so terrifying about that morning isn't just that a war has started, it's how it started. The world gets its first look at a terrifying new military doctrine.
Blitzkrieg, the lightning war.
Blitzkrieg. And it's interesting, if you were to look in a standard German to English dictionary from, say, 1938, you probably wouldn't find that word.
It wasn't really a term yet.
It wasn't a formal part of the lexicon. But after September 1st, 1939, no dictionary could possibly exist without it. It defined the moment.
So let's unpack that for everyone listening. Because I think people hear lightning war and the immediate thought is just, oh, they moved really fast. But it's so much more technical than that, isn't it?
Oh, much more. It's not just speed, it's coordination. It's the synthesis, the integration of fast-moving armored columns, the panzers, with motorized infantry.
So the foot soldiers could keep up with the tanks.
They could keep up. And all of this was supported very closely by air power, by the Luftwaffe. See, in previous wars, you'd have artillery pound an area for days, sometimes weeks.
Right, like at the Somme.
Exactly. Then the infantry would get out of their trenches and walk across a devastated no-man's land. Blitzkrieg is about paralysis. It's about psychology as much as it is about firepower.
So you're not trying to just grind the enemy down?
No. You punch a narrow hole in the enemy's front line with a concentration of tanks. Then you don't widen the hole, you rush through it. You race for the rear areas.
You go for the brain.
You go for the brain. You disrupt their communications. You destroy their supply depots. You sow chaos and confusion before they can even organize a coherent defense. You paralyze their ability to react.
It's like a nervous system attack on an army. Instead of trying to fight every single soldier on the front, you just bypass them, cut the phone lines, blow up the ammo dumps, and suddenly the army at the front is deaf, dumb, and blind. It can't be commanded anymore.
That is a perfect analogy. And you know what the key piece of technology was? It wasn't just the tank engine. It was the radio. The German tanks, most of them, had two-way radios. The commanders could talk to each other. The panzer leaders could talk directly to the Stuka pilots in the planes overhead.
So they could call in an airstrike on a specific strong point right there in real time.
In real time. Now contrast that with the Polish army. They were brave, incredibly brave, but their command structure often relied on runners on horseback or fragile telephone lines that were the first thing to be cut or bombed.
Yeah.
You have a 20th century coordinated machine fighting a 19th century command and control system. The outcome was almost inevitable.
And Poland was the testing ground for this whole new way of war.
It was, tragically, the first live-fire demonstration. And we need to be clear, the Polish army was not some medieval force. That's a myth. They had modern equipment, anti-tank guns, good artillery. But they were not prepared for this level of mechanization and, more importantly, this doctrine. They were fighting with immense courage, but they were being outmaneuvered by a completely new form of organized violence.
If you are enjoying this video, please watch it until the end. It helps the channel a lot and encourages us to continue our work.
And we have to remember, this wasn't just a military operation. It was deeply ideological from the very first minute.
Right, because at the same time, as you said, there's the annexation of Danzig.
Yes. The Free City of Danzig. It had been this major flashpoint for years. Hitler had been demanding its return to Germany. Poland refused, and rightly so, knowing that if they gave in on Danzig, it would just be the first of many demands. It was their main port to the sea.
So when the invasion starts, Danzig is immediately declared part of the Reich.
Immediately. It's the first political domino to fall. It signals that this isn't about border adjustments, it's about erasing a country.
It's just, the speed of it is staggering. You go from tense crisis negotiations to full-scale invasion and annexation in a matter of hours.
And that shock, that speed, was a deliberate part of the strategy. The psychological impact of the Stuka dive bombers with their Jericho trumpet sirens, the sheer speed of the tank columns appearing where they weren't expected, it was all designed to break the will of the opponent, to create a sense of hopelessness right from the start.
We should probably also address a common myth here, one that always comes up when people picture this invasion.
Ah, yes, the Polish cavalry.
The image of Polish lancers on horseback charging German tanks. That heroic but futile suicide charge. Did that actually happen?
Not in the way it's portrayed. It was largely a propaganda invention, one that both German and later Soviet propagandists found very useful.
So what's the real story?
There was an incident, a skirmish near Krogenty, where a Polish cavalry brigade, who were essentially highly mobile mounted infantry, not knights with lances, they caught a German infantry battalion in the open and successfully charged them with sabers. It was a successful attack.
Okay.
But then German armored cars showed up with machine guns and opened fire, forcing the cavalry to retreat. Later, Italian journalists were brought to the scene by the Germans. They saw the dead horses and the tanks nearby, and they created this romantic, tragic story of the old world suiciding against the new.
And the Nazis loved that story.
Of course they did. It made the Poles look foolish and backward. But the reality is the Poles were fighting a modern war as best they could. They were just strategically and technologically overwhelmed by a new system.
All right, so that brings us forward just 2 days to September 3rd. The ultimatums expire.
Yes, the ultimatums. This was Britain and France, who had given Poland a security guarantee, formally telling Germany, get your troops out of Poland now, or a state of war will exist between us.
And Hitler's response was essentially to ignore it.
He was gambling. He had gambled successfully so many times before in the Rhineland, in Austria, in Czechoslovakia. He genuinely believed that the Western powers were too weak, too decadent, too traumatized by the memory of the First World War to actually fight.
He thought they would protest, maybe impose some sanctions, but not declare war.
He wasn't convinced they'd go through with it. He was famously shocked when his foreign minister, Ribbentrop, brought in the news that Britain had actually declared war. He apparently turned to him and said, now what?
But they did it.
They did it. On September 3rd, 1939, France and the United Kingdom declare war on Germany. And we have to stop for a second and really appreciate the scope of that moment. When the UK declares war, it's not just an island in the North Sea entering the conflict.
It's the empire.
It's the entire British Empire. Within hours and days, you have Australia, New Zealand. Very soon after, you have Canada, you have South Africa, you have India. Suddenly, a conflict over a border in Central Europe is a global event.
So you have young men in Mumbai and Melbourne and Montreal preparing for war because tanks crossed a frontier thousands of miles away.
And that is the definition of a world war. The dominoes fell with incredible speed.
And it wasn't just a declaration for a land war somewhere down the line. The conflict became a world war at sea almost instantly, didn't it?
That is such a crucial point. On that very same day, September 3rd, just hours after the declaration of war, a German U-boat torpedoed and sank the passenger liner SS Epinia off the coast of Ireland, believing it was an armed merchant cruiser. The Battle of the Atlantic began.
The longest single campaign of the entire war.
The longest, and you could argue the most strategically critical campaign of the war for the Western Allies. Britain is an island. It has to import everything: food, fuel, steel, weapons. Germany knew this. They couldn't hope to match the Royal Navy ship for ship on the surface.
Not at that stage.
Not a chance. So their strategy was asymmetrical. They turned to the U-boats, the submarines.
The wolf packs.
Well, the Wolfpack tactics would be developed a bit later, but the threat was immediate. From day one, U-boats began targeting the supply routes. The goal was simple: to strangle Britain, to starve the island into submission. So while the armies on the continent were still mobilizing and sort of staring at each other, the war at sea was lethal from hour one.
And that immediately brings the war to the doorstep of the Americas, to the shipping lanes of the entire Atlantic Ocean. It changes the texture of the conflict right away.
Absolutely. There are no front lines at sea. The battlefield is everywhere.
It's interesting you mentioned the difference between what's happening on land and at sea, because that brings us to what you might call the hidden front. While U-boats are diving and tanks are rolling, a very different kind of soldier is getting on a train to a place called Bletchley Park.
September 4th, 1939. Just one day after Britain declares war, a brilliant, eccentric mathematician named Alan Turing reports for duty at the Government Code and Cipher School, which had just moved to this Victorian country estate called Bletchley Park.
I just love this part of the history. It feels like a spy novel, but it's actually a story about applied mathematics saving the world.
It really is. And for anyone listening who's curious about the secret histories of the war, this is a pivotal moment. The war wasn't just fought with high explosives and steel, it was fought with logic, with algorithms, with mathematics. Turing's arrival at Bletchley Park represents the mobilization of the mind into the war effort.
And the enemy here isn't a panzer division, it's a machine, the Enigma.
The Enigma machine. To look at it, it just seemed like a strange sort of typewriter in a wooden box. But inside, it was a fiendishly complex electromechanical system of rotors and plug boards.
So how did it work, in simple terms?
Okay, so a German operator would press a key, let's say the letter A. An electrical signal would pass through a series of rotating wheels, or rotors, which would scramble it, and then a lamp would light up under a different letter, say X.
So A becomes X, simple substitution.
But, and this is the genius of it, the moment he pressed that key, one of the rotors would click forward one position. So if you press A again, the electrical path would be different. This time it might light up Q.
So you can't just do frequency analysis. You can't just figure out that A always equals X.
Exactly. The same letter would be encrypted differently every single time it appeared, even within the same message. And it gets much, much worse. The Germans changed the starting positions of these rotors every single day at midnight.
And that's not all, is it? There was another layer of complexity.
There was. The real genius of the military enigma, the thing that made it so terrifyingly secure, was the plug board, the steckerbrett on the front.
What did that do?
Think of an old-fashioned telephone switchboard. It had 26 sockets, one for each letter of the alphabet. The operator would use cables to swap pairs of letters before the signal even entered the rotors. So A might be swapped with M and T with K. This feature, just as one feature, exploded the number of possible combinations into the stratosphere.
So how many possible settings are we talking about?
We are talking about roughly 150 million possible settings.
Wow. Okay, so trial and error was completely impossible. You'd need a billion people working for a billion years.
Correct. Brute forcing it was dead on arrival. But thankfully, the Allies had a crucial head start, and it came from the Polish.
Right. We absolutely have to give credit here. The Polish Cipher Bureau had been working on this problem for years before the invasion.
Absolutely. A team of brilliant mathematicians, Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Ruzicki, and Henryk Gizgalski. They had done the foundational work. They used abstract algebra and group theory to figure out the internal wiring of the rotors, something the British and French thought was impossible.
And they had even built their own machines to help decrypt messages.
They had. They built early electromechanical devices they called bombas to find the daily keys. But then the Germans added more rotors and the plug board, making their methods obsolete. So just before the invasion, in a dramatic secret meeting in the woods outside Warsaw, they handed over everything they knew, reconstructed Enigma machines, their methods, everything to British and French intelligence. They passed the torch.
So Turing arrives at Bletchley, and he takes this Polish torch, and his task, essentially, is to design a machine that can defeat a machine.
That's the core concept. You can't beat this kind of industrial-scale encryption with a human brain and a pencil. You need a machine. And this leads Turing, along with Gordon Welchman, to design the bomb.
And the bomb was this massive, ticking, noisy machine.
A huge cabinet, about 7 feet tall, 7 feet wide, with rows and rows of spinning drums on the front that simulated the Enigma rotors. It was an electromechanical device designed to search through all the possible rotor settings to find the correct one for that day's messages.
But it wasn't just brute force, was it? It was smarter than that.
It was much smarter. It was based on logic and statistical analysis. It worked by looking for internal contradictions. The codebreakers realized they could rely on certain predictable habits of the German operators.
Like what?
Well, many messages would contain standard phrases like Wetterbericht for a weather report, or they would end with Hail Hitler. The Bletchley team called these cribs short snippets of guessed plain text.
And they could use that guess to program the bomb.
Exactly. They would set up the machine to test a theory. What if this encrypted text here corresponds to Wetterbericht? The bomb would then churn through the settings. And for almost all of them, this assumption would lead to a logical contradiction, like a letter being encrypted as itself, which Enigma couldn't do. If a setting didn't produce a contradiction, the machine would stop. That would give the codebreakers a potential solution to check.
And this incredible effort, this ultra-intelligence, it all starts right there in September 1939. It would eventually be credited with shortening the war by 2, maybe even 4 years. It's just amazing to think of Turing walking into that Victorian mansion while the world was falling apart, and in doing so, effectively jump-starting the computer age in order to fight fascism.
It is the ultimate collision of eras that I mentioned before. You have this Victorian country house architecture, and inside it, the birth of what we would now call digital logic and information theory.
Meanwhile, back on the ground in Poland, a terrible situation is about to get unimaginably worse. We get to September 17th, and this is the twist of the knife.
It's the stab in the back. That's what the Poles called it, and it's hard to argue with that description.
The Soviet invasion.
Yes. For the first 2.5 weeks of the war, Poland is fighting for its very existence against Germany in the West. They're retreating, they're taking heavy losses, but they are still fighting. They're still an organized force, hoping against hope that France and Britain will launch a major offensive on the Western Front to draw German forces away.
They were counting on their allies.
They were. And then, on the morning of September 17th, the Red Army rolls across Poland's entire eastern border.
Why? I mean, we know now, of course, but at the time, this must have been utterly confusing to the world. Ideologically, Hitler and Stalin were mortal enemies. Fascism and communism were supposed to be polar opposite.
And that's the profound shock of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which had been signed just a few weeks earlier in late August. Publicly, it was just a non-aggression pact. A cynical deal, sure. But on the surface, it was just, we won't attack you, you won't attack us.
But there was more to it. There were the secret protocols.
The secret protocols. A secret addendum to the treaty that the rest of the world didn't know about. It was essentially a plan for the complete dismemberment of Eastern Europe.
They drew a line on a map.
They literally drew a line on a map of Poland and the Baltic states. Germany gets this sphere of influence. The Soviet Union gets that sphere of influence. So when the Soviets invaded on September 17th, they weren't joining the Allies to fight Hitler. They were acting as Hitler's partner to destroy and partition Poland.
What was the official justification they gave at the time?
The official line was that the Polish state had effectively collapsed and ceased to exist, and that the Soviet Union needed to intervene to protect the ethnic populations of Ukrainians and Belarusians who lived in eastern Poland.
A humanitarian mission.
A cynical pretext for a pre-planned territorial grab.
So now Poland is facing an impossible situation, a two-front war against two of the largest military powers on Earth.
It was the end. The Polish military command had a fallback strategy. It was called the Romanian bridgehead. The idea was to have the remaining forces retreat to the rugged terrain in the southeast of the country, near the border with friendly Romania.
It's hilly country, right? Hard for tanks.
Exactly. Swamps, forests, hills. The plan was to hold out there through the winter, get resupplied by the Allies through Romania, and wait for the West to finally attack Germany.
But the Soviet invasion from the east completely killed that plan.
It cut them off at the knees. It severed the escape route. It also broke the army's morale. The Polish commander-in-chief, Marshal Sumigiritz, realized it was over. He gave a heartbreaking order to his troops. Don't fight the Soviets unless they attack you first. Your goal is now simply to evacuate. Get to Romania, get to Hungary, get to France, and keep fighting from there. The state was collapsing.
And this all leads us into late September and the final act of the campaign, the fall of Warsaw. The siege there was exceptionally brutal.
It was one of the first times a major modern European capital was subjected to that kind of sustained, indiscriminate terror bombing. The Luftwaffe had absolute air superiority, and they just pounded the city relentlessly. Residential areas, hospitals, cultural sites,
And the citizens fought back.
they fought with incredible bravery. The citizens of Warsaw, men and women, dug anti-tank ditches in the city parks. They put up barricades. They fought in the streets. The mayor, a man named Stefan Starzycki, became this heroic figure. He stayed on the radio day and night, broadcasting messages of defiance and hope to keep morale up, even as the walls were shaking around him.
But in the end, they were cut off. No food, no ammunition.
The water. The German bombing had deliberately targeted and destroyed the city's water filtration plants. Disease was starting to spread. Faced with the humanitarian catastrophe, Warsaw finally surrendered on September 27th.
A devastating moment. But it's important to make a distinction here, isn't it? The capital surrendered, the government went into exile,
Right.
but the resistance was just beginning.
That's a vital point. The organized regular army was defeated. The final major battle of the campaign, the Battle of Kocek, ended on October 6th when the last large Polish army unit capitulated. But even before that battle ended, the seeds of the underground were being sown.
So officers were hiding their uniforms, burying weapons.
Exactly. They were forming secret cells. The Polish underground state, which was created in these days, became one of the largest and most sophisticated resistance movements of the entire war. They never formally surrendered the nation itself, just the regular armed forces. The fight continued, just in a different form.
We also really need to talk about what happened after the fighting stopped in Poland, because this wasn't an old-fashioned occupation where you just change the flag on the government buildings and collect taxes. This was the start of something much, much darker. This was Operation Tannenberg.
This is where the true nature of the Nazi regime is laid bare for the world to see, if they were willing to look. The Nazis had prepared lists. Operation Tannenberg was the code name for the specific, systematic targeting and elimination of the entire Polish leadership class, the intelligentsia.
So we're talking about university professors, doctors, lawyers, priests, local politicians, artists.
Anyone who could potentially form the nucleus of a future Polish resistance or help preserve Polish culture. The Einsatzgruppen, these special mobile killing units, followed right behind the regular army, the Wehrmacht. Their job wasn't to fight soldiers. It was to round up and murder civilians from these lists.
And this happened immediately.
Immediately. In September and October of 1939, tens of thousands of Poland's brightest and best were taken into forests or town squares and shot. It was a decapitation strike against a nation's soul.
And the annexation of Western Poland, of Danzig, that began the process of expulsions.
Yes. It was the beginning of what the Nazis called the racial reordering of Europe. Poles and Jews were systematically evicted from their homes and farms in the annexed territories, often with only a few minutes' notice, to make room for ethnic German settlers. Jewish people were herded into makeshift ghettos. This 61-day period sets the horrifying tone for the war of annihilation that was to come. It showed the world that this wasn't just about territory. It was about demographics, racial ideology, and erasure. It was a terrifying glimpse into the Holocaust.
While this absolute horror is unfolding in the East, the West is. Well, we'll get to the Phoney War in just a minute, but the war at sea delivered a massive shock to the British in mid-October, a real blow to their confidence.
October 14th, 1939, the raid on Scapa Flow.
Now, for anyone who doesn't know, Scapa Flow is supposed to be the safest place on Earth for the British home fleet.
It's this huge natural harbor up in the Orkney Islands, way north of Scotland. It's surrounded by a ring of islands, making it naturally defensible. It was the main base for the Grand Fleet in World War I. The British Admiralty believed it was impenetrable to submarines. They had sunken block ships in the channels, anti-submarine nets, constant patrols. It was a fortress.
But a German U-boat, U-47, got in.
The commander of U-47, a man named Günther Prien, pulled off one of the most audacious naval raids in history. He studied charts and intelligence and identified a very narrow, shallow channel called Kirk's Sound that the British thought was impassable.
Why did they think that?
The tides ripped through it with incredible force,
Yeah.
and they had sunk 3 block ships in it. But Prien calculated that at slack tide, at night, during a spring tide when the water was highest, he might just be able to scrape over the top of the sunken ships.
Incredibly risky.
Incredibly. He navigated on the surface in the dark and literally scraped his way into the main anchorage of the British fleet.
And once he was inside, he found a target.
He found the battleship HMS Royal Oak, a veteran of the Battle of Jutland in the First World War. He fired a salvo of torpedoes. Amazingly, the first volley did only minor damage. One torpedo hit the anchor chain, and the British crew didn't even realize they were under attack. They thought it was a small internal explosion, a cordite fire or something.
So Priyan is just sitting there inside the enemy's main naval base, and they don't even know he's there.
The audacity is just breathtaking. He turned his boat around, reloaded his forward torpedo tubes, and fired again.
And this time,
The torpedoes hit squarely amidships, detonating one of the ship's main magazines. The Royal Oak was torn apart by a massive internal explosion. It capsized and sank in just 13 minutes. Over 800 men died. Many of them were boy sailors as young as 15 or 16.
the psychological impact of that must have been enormous.
It was a thunderclap. Churchill had just returned to his old job as First Lord of the Admiralty, and this happened on his watch. It proved that the Royal Navy, the pride of Britain, was vulnerable even in its own bedroom. For the Germans, it was a colossal propaganda victory. Priyan became a national hero. For the British, it was a humiliating and painful wake-up call that there were no safe havens in this war.
So we have the complete collapse of Poland, this shocking blow at Scapa Flow, the code breakers secretly working away at Bletchley. And then on October 21st, 1939, a quiet meeting takes place in Washington, D.C., a meeting that almost nobody noticed at the time, but which, in hindsight, might be the single most important event of this entire period.
The first meeting of the Advisory Committee on Uranium.
And this is the bureaucratic, unassuming dawn of the atomic age.
It is. The context here is absolutely key. The United States is officially neutral and wants to stay that way. But a group of refugee scientists, most famously Albert Einstein, prompted by Leo Szilard, had written a letter to President Roosevelt.
The famous Einstein-Szilard letter.
That's the one. They warned him that recent discoveries in nuclear physics, specifically the fission of uranium, show that it might be possible to create extremely powerful bombs of a new type.
And they explicitly warned that Nazi Germany, with its brilliant physicists, might already be working on developing such a weapon.
Exactly. That was the alarm bell. So Roosevelt, taking the warning seriously, sets up this small committee. They hold their first meeting on October 21st. It's very humble, very bureaucratic beginning. A few scientists, a couple of military officers, they discuss the potential. And they approve a very small amount of initial funding.
How small are we talking?
$6,000.
$6,000
Yeah.
for what would eventually become the Manhattan Project.
That's how it started. $6,000 to buy some graphite and uranium for initial experiments. But think about that timeline. While the Einsatzgruppen are carrying out massacres in Polish forests, while U-boats are hunting convoys in the cold Atlantic, a few men in a quiet committee room in Washington are taking the first administrative step toward the atomic bomb. The race didn't start in 1943 or 44. It started right here, in this specific window of autumn 1939.
It really just perfectly emphasizes your original point about the collision of eras. You have horse-drawn supply wagons still being used by some armies in Poland, and at the same time you have the beginning of nuclear physics being weaponized in Washington.
Precisely. It's the friction between the dying past and the terrifying nascent future, all happening at once.
Now we absolutely have to address the giant elephant in the room regarding the Western Front. We've described this intense revolutionary violence in Poland and this deadly war at sea. But if you were a French soldier on the border with Germany in October 1939, what exactly were you doing?
You were probably playing cards.
Sure.
Or washing your socks, maybe writing letters home complaining about the damp weather and the boredom.
This is the Phoney War.
Or as the Germans called it, the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war.
So why? Poland was their ally. It was being destroyed. They had a treaty obligation to help. Why didn't France and Britain launch a massive attack on Germany from the west while the bulk of the German army was busy in the east?
It is the great, tragic what-if of the early war. But to understand it, you have to understand the psychology of the French and British high commands. These were men who had been junior officers in the First World War.
They remembered the Somme. They remembered Verdun.
They remembered it viscerally. They remembered the slaughter of millions of men for a few yards of muddy ground. Their entire military doctrine was built around the idea that attacking heavily fortified positions was suicidal.
And so they built the Maginot Line.
The Maginot Line. It was a technological marvel, an immense chain of concrete and steel fortifications. It had underground bunkers, retractable gun turrets, air conditioning, its own electric trains connecting the forts. The entire French strategy was defensive.
They thought they could just sit behind their wall.
They believed that modern weapons overwhelmingly favored the defender. Their plan was, we will sit behind our impenetrable concrete wall, the Royal Navy will blockade Germany's ports, we will slowly starve them out over years. They were expecting a long war of attrition, just like the last one.
So they were literally fighting the previous war.
They were fighting 1918 all over again. They didn't understand Blitzkrieg yet. They saw what happened in Poland, but they rationalized it. They thought, well, that's Poland. The Polish army wasn't as good as ours. They thought they had time. And while they waited, Germany finished off Poland, moved its entire army back to the west, refitted, rearmed, and prepared to do to France in 1940 exactly what it had just done to Poland.
It's just a tragic paradox, isn't it? The very caution that was meant to save lives to avoid another Battle of the Somme ended up being the thing that allowed Germany to consolidate its gains and prepare for an even greater conquest.
It created a deeply false sense of security. If you look at newspapers from Britain in October 1939, people started to relax. They thought, well, maybe this won't be so bad after all. Maybe it'll just be a blockade war with not much fighting. They even called it the Boer War. They had no idea that the hammer was being raised, ready to smash them in the spring of 1940.
So let's just zoom out for a final thought and look at these 61 days as a whole. September 1st to October 31st, 1939. What is the final picture?
The final picture is one of breathtaking, world-altering transformation. In that short time, a major European nation, Poland, was completely wiped from the map, its territory carved up between two totalitarian superpowers.
A regional conflict became a global one.
Instantly, the British Empire mobilized for war. The Atlantic Ocean became a lethal battleground, a graveyard for merchant ships. The secret war began, with the codebreakers at Bletchley Park starting the Battle of Wits that would prove so crucial.
And the United States, still neutral, took the first tiny step toward building the weapon that would ultimately end the war.
All of that happened, and yet at the same time, on the main front in the West, there was this eerie silence, this paralysis.
That contrast really is what defines this period, isn't it?
It is. It's the contrast between the sudden, shocking violence of the new age of warfare and the slow, paralyzed, backward-looking reaction of the old order. You could say the old world died on September 1st. By October 31st, we were fully in the terrifying, unknown territory of the Second World War.
It's a really sobering reminder of just how quickly the entire ground can shift beneath our feet. One day you're debating diplomacy and border disputes. 60 days later, the world is on fire and the rules have completely changed.
And it also reminds us that while we often focus on the maps and the arrows of armies, the seeds of ultimate victory and ultimate horror-like, the quiet work at Bletchley Park or the meeting of the Uranium Committee are often being sown in quiet rooms, even as the loudest battles are being fought and lost.
A truly fascinating and pivotal 2 months. We hope this is giving you a new perspective on how the Second World War actually began, not just as a date in a textbook, but as a complex, terrifying, and transformative 61-day period.
Indeed, it really is a lesson in how quickly and how violently history can accelerate.
If viewers enjoyed the video, they can subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell to be notified about new videos, click the like button, and share the video with their colleagues, as this helps us maintain the channel. Thank you.